purpose of this video is to give you an overview of how the machine operates, and it's not intended to replace an instructor-led demonstration. So be sure you've participated in an instructor-led demonstration before you use the machine on your own. So let's begin with reviewing the nomenclature or the names of the parts on this machine. All right, so we'll start here. This is the on-off switch for the machine. We have a computer box. We have the 1 horsepower electric motor. We have the drawbar knob here. We have the feed dial and feed lock located right here. We have the cutter bits here. We have 2 tool holders or cutter levers that hold those cutter bits. We have a lock lever here to lock those cutter bits down, hold them steady. We have, when we loosen that lock lever, we have 2 knobs to adjust the depth of the cutter bits into the rotor. And then we have another lock knob here that adjusts the lateral movement of the cutter bits so that we can adjust the position of that cutter head so that the rotor is directly in the center between the levers. If we look over here, we have the drive flange assembly and the solenoid assembly. This is an adjustment solenoid that will automatically adjust this drive flange to match up with the rotor hub and reduce any possibility of excessive runout. Okay, we have a couple of handles here that'll help us get the machine into place. A couple of handles also here when we're ready to get the height set up to attach the machine to the rotor. We have a lever here called the disc lock lever that allows us to rotate the lathe this direction. You can lock it into place. You'll also see that we have some adapter plates hanging on the sides of the machine. We have the silencers, a selection of silencers that are hanging on the machine. We have a lug nut kit here. We'll be using these nuts, not the lug nuts that hold the wheel on. And then we have a small tool kit located right here. So everything is self-contained on the machine, well organized. When you're finished using the machine, please have it looking as good or better than the way you found it. So you can see we've lifted the vehicle up so that the hub is just about belt buckle height. So we have the car at a comfortable working height. We've removed the caliper assembly, and we have a yellow hook that we're just hooked to the coil spring up here, and we've hooked into the bolt hole that mounts the caliper to the steering knuckle. And so we've got the caliper securely hung here. These hooks stay with the machine. You get 2 hooks with each machine. So try to remember to remove those hooks at the end of the job. It's kind of an easy thing to forget and leave them hanging on the coil springs sometimes. We've also unlocked the steering wheel, placed the transmission in neutral, and we have the steering wheel with the wheels in the straight ahead position. Okay, we've selected a 5-lug adapter here. I'm going to slide it over the lug, over the studs, and then I'm going to rotate it around until I'm in the most narrow part of the slot here, and then using the lug nut out of the toolkit, we'll begin putting the adapter into place. You can see there's a variety of lug nuts. Okay, so again, we've selected the narrowest part of the slot here where there's a taper machined in, and we'll line that taper up with the taper on these nuts. And I'm just going to hand tighten them again for now, and then we're just going to use, in this case, a 19mm opened-end wrench to go around and tighten the nuts. There's no way to get a torque wrench on here. The owner's manual for the machine states 25 to 30 foot-pounds. So you can adjust your wrench and your torque wrench that's built into your wrist to 25 or 30 foot-pounds. I think the main thing to remember is just tighten evenly, consistently, all the way around to get the adapter plate snug up against the rotor hat assembly. Another point that I should make that's very important is the rotor hat assembly. Make sure that it's clean, free of rust and debris. before you put the adapter plate on. We want to try to reduce any run out that we introduce into the adapter by not having a clean surface to attach it to. Notice that the adapter plate has a dowel pin, and this dowel pin will need to line up with one of the holes in the drive flange. So when we get ready to position the lathe onto the hub, be careful as you move it in. Don't crash the cutter head into the rotor. Try to make sure you have enough clearance to move it into the wheel well area. I'm going to pull up on the lathe to line the flange up against the adapter plate. I can feel that I'm locked into that dowel. And then now I can move the drawbar handle, and I should feel the drawbar start to thread easily into the adapter plate. Don't rush this, don't force anything, don't pry anything. It should slide right in. Very easy, be easy to screw in. And then you know you've got a nice clean connection, and then just hand tighten it. Now that we're securely attached to the adapter plate and to the rotor, we're ready to turn the machine on and compensate for any run out that's going to be between that drive flange and the adapter plate. So we're going to turn on the motor, and then we're going to push this start button, at which point hopefully you'll be able to hear the adjustment solenoids. You'll hear some clicking sounds as they automatically adjust that drive flange to reduce run out. There, you can see it didn't take much adjustment. We had a nice clean flange. We're working on a relatively new car here, but you can see we have two green LEDs that have illuminated here. We've got an optimum compensation here, which means that we have 1/1000th of an inch or less run out now between the machine and the drive flange. Okay, now we want to adjust our cutter head. And before we do, we have the lathe in a pretty good position right now, but I wanted to point out this disc lock lever that allows you to rotate the lathe back and forth a little bit so that you can make adjustments so that the cutter bits can go in and not be obstructed by anything. You want to make sure there isn't anything behind the rotor and obviously in front of the rotor that's going to interfere with our cutter bit. So there's this adjustment here. We've got that locked into an optimal place. Now we're going to get the cutter head set up in a way that the rotor will be centered right in between our cutter bits. Okay, the first thing I like to do is rotate the depth control knobs out so that the cutter bit arms are parallel to each other. This just gives me a better visual so that when I loosen the lateral adjustment knob here, I can look straight down and get the rotor lined up right in between my cutter bits. So I'm going to stick my head in here, look straight down. That looks nice and centered. Now I'm going to lock this lateral lock wing nut here, and that's going to stay put right there. Okay, now we're going to establish the depth of our cutter. So I'm going to rotate the feed knob, and I'm going to move the cutters in about midway into the rotor lining surface here. I'm going to turn on the motor, and then rotate the cutter depth knobs just until you hear the cutters lightly touch the surface of the rotor. So we have the rear cutter bit and the outer cutter bit just barely touching the surface of the rotor. That's going to establish what we call our 0 point. And I'm going to lock the levers down. If we don't lock these levers down, we don't get a good cut. So try to remember that step. Once you've established your cutters, every time you make an adjustment on those cutters, you need to relock this lever here. Okay. All right, so we should have those cutters set in a way that we'll get a light continuous cut as we rotate the feed knob in either direction. sometimes you'll find that rotors wear thinner on the outer side than they do on the inner side. So if you start in the middle, you might find that your cutters are cutting, they're a deeper cut as you move towards the hub and a lighter cut as you move out towards the edge of the rotor. So you might need to make small adjustments along the way. Okay, so I've selected a rotor that's been in service on a vehicle for quite a few thousand miles. And you can see it's normal for the rotor to have a ridge that is developed around the outer side of the rotor. This is the surface where the brake lining, the brake pad, rubs up against the rotor. And so you can see it's common for there to be an inner ridge and an outer ridge. We don't really need to cut into this inner ridge. Maybe just we'll undercut it a little bit. But when this outer ridge is high, we'll probably want to manually rotate the feed dial and take this off manually before we set the machine up to cut the rotor automatically. So let me show you how we're going to do that. So we have a tiny little rusty ridge on this newer vehicle that we're demonstrating with today. So I'm going to turn on the machine, and then again I'm going to rotate out by hand to manually remove that ridge, and then that way it won't be taking a deep cut that could possibly damage the tool cutters on the way out. Okay, now that I've removed that ridge, I'm going to adjust my auto off so that if I'm over preparing the other side to machine, once the cutter bits rotate back about this far, the machine will automatically shut off before the cutter head runs into the inner fender well here. So with my auto stop adjusted and the lock nut tight, we're going to go back in. I'm going to turn the machine on. We're going to run in towards the hub now and establish our depth of cut. I'm going to go a little bit into that rusty area towards the center of the hub, just so I can be sure I've cleared enough surface area so that the new pads, the friction material in the new pads will have a nice machine surface to ride on. Now I'm going to loosen up my tool lock lever so I can establish my depth of cut. Now each increment on the depth dials equals about 2.5 thousandths. The operator's manual suggests that you rotate 2 increments on each side for a total of 5 thousandths of an inch cut on each side. So once you've established that cut, tighten down the lock lever, and then we're going to put our silencer in place. You'll notice there are some little grooves in here that will go in and grab onto the heads of the bolts that hold the cutter bits to the arms, to the holders. And now I'm going to engage my auto feed pin here. There we go. And now the machine will begin to draw automatically the cutter bits back and make our cut. All right, it'll take just a couple of minutes to machine the surface of the rotor. Again, it's very important to have safety glasses on, keep loose sleeves, loose clothing away from rotating parts, keep hands away, let the machine do its job. Okay, you can see that the cutter bits are getting close to the outer edge of the rotor, and again, before we removed that ridge, and so we don't have to worry about the cutters being overworked or damaged by cutting in to a very deep cut as they cut to an outer rusty ridge. We removed that by hand ahead of time. We have a nice quiet tool. All right, the cutters have cleared the edge of the rotor, and if we have our auto stop adjusted correctly, the machine shuts down Of course, that's very important that it shuts down so that it doesn't continue to move the cutter head into the inner wheel well here and cause you problems there. Okay, so once you've completed the cut, you'll want to look carefully at both sides. Use a flashlight so you can see the rotor easily. And if you've got a good finish cut all the way through, then we're going to remove the silencer, loosen the lock lever, back the cutter bits out away from the rotor, and then we're going to remove the drawbar and pull the lathe away. Now, I'll make a point here. You'll notice that we demonstrated this lathe with the lathe right side up. You can see everything. But when you go around to the other side of the car, the rotor's going to have, the lathe rather, is going to have to rotate upside down. So the first cut that you make, and the first time you use the machine for that matter, you'll want to start with the rotor, with the lathe right side up and machine the rotor. Then all you have to do is simply rotate it around, move it to the other side of the car, and you won't need to make those lateral adjustments. You'll have to work upside down, but everything will be set really close to the way you had it set on this side of the car with the lathe right side up. So always start with your initial setup, and the first rotor that you machine should be done with the lathe right side up. It's also recommended that you use 150 grit sandpaper on a sanding block and move it around the surface to reduce the surface roughness. This helps sort of even out the little peaks and valleys from the cutter tool and helps assist the wear-in of your new pads, reducing noise, increasing customer satisfaction. Okay, I'm going to remove the adapter plate here and get ready to move it to the other side. If you're finished with using the machine, be sure and return the lug nuts back to the lug nut kit. Hang the adapter back on the machine and clean the machine with a brush, removing any chips. Sweep up around from underneath of the rotor. Clean the floor when you're finished. Don't forget to measure the rotor thickness with a micrometer. Make sure that the rotor is not undersized under the manufacturer's minimum thickness recommendations. Also, don't forget to torque the hold down bolts that hold the caliper frame to the knuckle. And don't forget to torque your lug nuts when you put the wheel back on in the proper sequence and the proper torque. So this video is just a quick overview of how to use the lathe. Again, don't use the video alone. Be sure to participate in an instructor-led demonstration. Always wear your safety glasses. Chips will be flying. Keep loose clothing away from rotating parts. Thanks for watching.